Her body was located just over an embankment, just sort of at the top of an embankment.
She was a 21-year-old college student, a newlywed, and just hours away from being stabbed over 40 times and left on the side of a highway. But the most shocking detail wasn't the brutality of Latrese Curtis's murder. It was the man arrested for it, a pastor, a man who preached salvation on Sundays and hunted an innocent woman on a Tuesday night. This is the twisted story of obsession, jealousy, and a killer hiding in plain sight. But before Latrese became a victim, she was a young woman with dreams, a newlywed starting her life in Raleigh, North Carolina, with a husband she'd married after just a few months of dating. By all accounts, 2008 should have been her year, until one night, every choice she'd made and secrets she'd kept collided with a predator's rage. In early 2008, Latrese had settled into life with her new husband Darren in Raleigh, North Carolina. The two tied the knot the previous April after a brief courtship that quickly turned into a committed partnership. Latrese, who had previously attended both Bennett College and Wake Tech, was continuing her education at North Carolina Central University, pursuing a degree in accounting. To support herself, she worked part-time at the local Sears store. Those who knew her best described Latrese as someone who naturally lifted the mood of any room she entered. Her energy was warm, her smile familiar, and her presence left a lasting impression. Friends often said she made the ordinary feel a little more joyful, perhaps the kind of person who could make even a tax class seem tolerable. There's no clear record of how Latrese first crossed paths with Darren, but getting married at just 20 years old was undoubtedly a major leap for someone still figuring life out. While it's likely that she cared deeply for him, it's possible she wasn't fully prepared for the responsibilities that came with that commitment. Today, most of what the public knows about Latrese revolves around the tragic circumstances of her passing, leaving the details of her actual life in the shadows. What is certain is that she was still navigating young adulthood, a time when mistakes are more common than people admit. And while her decisions may have placed her in a complicated situation, they weren't what ultimately ended her story. They just set the stage for someone else's cruel choices. Latrese and Darren had exchanged vows in the spring of 2007. Around that same time, she was also involved with another young man. It's unclear if their connection began before the marriage or after, but their relationship continued throughout that year. The man's name was Stephen, and he too was attending the same university as Latrese. It would make sense if that's how their paths crossed. Stephen, known for playing basketball at the school, had earned a reputation for being particularly well-liked among the female students. He later admitted he knew Latrese was married, but claimed she told him she and Darren had separated. That said, Stephen had a girlfriend of his own, so his moral compass might have been pointing more toward "don't ask, don't care" than north. The contents of Latrese's thoughts that winter evening remain unknown. Perhaps the vows had been exchanged too soon, the honeymoon glow had dimmed, and a wish for escape settled in. No public record has been uncovered indicating serious quarrels in the young household, yet an affair was underway. But before we begin, I just want to say thank you to my amazing viewers and subscribers. Your support through likes, shares, and comments means the world to me. Your engagement helps make these stories even more meaningful. If you're new here, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and join our growing community of true crime enthusiasts. On Tuesday, 29th January 2008, Latrese visited Stephen's place after her afternoon lecture ended. Time was spent in private, details are best omitted, and afterward she slid behind the wheel to head home. Around 10 p.m., Darren received a call in which she said class had run late and she would grab takeout on the way. It sounded like a routine night to him. In hindsight, it was the calm before paperwork nobody likes filing. Later that night, a decision was made by Stephen to visit his official girlfriend, so the basement flat was locked and a drive taken to her house, where their friend Warren happened to be. While there, a call was placed to Latrese as she navigated the late-night roads. Stephen would later state that she suggested their hidden romance move to a higher tier, a promotion he was not prepared to authorize. She was assured the topic could wait until their next meeting. Stephen lingered at his girlfriend's home until roughly 1:30 a.m., then headed back, an itinerary that proved even juggling chainsaws might offer fewer risks to one's future. That night, Latrese never returned to the apartment she shared with Darren. At first, he figured she might have stopped by her parents' house to spend the night. Maybe she needed space or just wanted to visit. But when morning came and there was still no sign of her and her phone continued to go unanswered, concern began to grow. At exactly 8:25 a.m. on January 30th, Darren picked up the phone and contacted emergency services. "I spoke with her Tuesday night. She said she was driving home," he told the dispatcher. "She hasn't come back since." What Darren didn't realize at the time was that, nearly an hour before his call, 911 had already begun receiving reports about a woman's body spotted near the edge of the I-540. Responding officers arrived on scene and found a tragic discovery. A young woman had been left just off the highway. Injuries were severe and clearly intentional. Not far from where she was found, a white Nissan Sentra sat abandoned, a quiet witness to what had happened just moments before. In an unfortunate twist of fate, shortly after Darren made his report, he took to the road himself in hopes of spotting Latrese. As he drove down the very stretch of I-540 mentioned in those early reports, his eyes caught a familiar sight, the same model and color of car Latrese had been driving. It was parked near a cordoned-off scene. But rather than panic, Darren tried to piece things together calmly, choosing first to trace who might have last spoken with his wife. Sometimes denial takes the wheel just long enough to delay heartbreak. Court documents later revealed that Darren had managed to review Latrese's phone activity from the night she disappeared. It was then that he noticed multiple calls placed to a number he recognized as Stephen's. Wanting answers, Darren dialed the number himself. He introduced who he was and let Stephen know that Latrese hadn't come home. The details of that conversation aren't public, but it's been reported that Stephen asked Darren to keep him informed if he heard anything. Stephen hadn't had any contact with Latrese after their phone call that evening. However, when he woke up the next morning, he saw that he had missed a call from her at around 2 a.m. Meanwhile, Darren, after ending his call with Stephen, decided to return to the stretch of I-540 where police activity had been unfolding. It was there, in the daylight, that he recognized the car. Pulling over, Darren approached the authorities and tried to remain composed. He showed them a photo of Latrese and explained that the vehicle at the scene matched hers exactly. Holding out hope, even for just a moment longer, he asked the question no one wants to say out loud. "Please tell me that isn't her," he said, because even when everything points to yes, the heart still bargains for a no. Sadly, it was confirmed that the victim was indeed Latrese. That morning's tragedy had already reached the news, and as fate would have it, Latrese's father happened to be watching when reports of a body found along the highway began circulating. At the time, he had no reason to believe it involved his daughter, but by later that day, he and Latrese's mother were given the heartbreaking truth. Their daughter had been killed. Around 11 a.m., investigators brought Darren to the police station for questioning. Though he didn't have a confirmed alibi for the night Latrese disappeared, he fully cooperated, submitting a DNA sample, taking a polygraph test, and allowing authorities to search both his car and the home they shared. The investigation was now focused on retracing Latrese's final steps, because whoever had taken her life likely crossed paths with her not long before it happened. Fortunately, a tip from a highway patrol officer would help police make quick progress. At approximately 1:30 a.m. on January 30th, a state trooper noticed a vehicle pulled over near the area where Latrese was later discovered. Its hazard lights were flashing, the driver's window was cracked halfway down, and while the doors were locked, the keys remained in the ignition. No one appeared to be around. The trooper also observed another vehicle, a white Nissan Sentra, parked across the highway, also with its hazards blinking. That second car, as it turned out, was registered to Latrese. The scene didn't make much sense at the time, but soon it would. The trooper later reported seeing Latrese's car parked in the same area where her body would eventually be found. Curious, he decided to check the plates of a second vehicle nearby. That car came back registered to a man named Robert Reeves. At first, detectives had no clue who Robert was. His name didn't ring any bells for Latrese's loved ones either. With no obvious link to the case, it seemed possible the car's presence was just an odd coincidence, nothing more. But as investigators began examining the connections more closely, they found something that raised eyebrows. Robert Reeves shared a home address with Stephen, the man Latrese had been seeing. This discovery added a new layer of mystery to an already complex case. For a time, detectives were left trying to piece together how, if at all, Stephen and Robert were both involved in what had happened. But as more information came to light, the vague outlines of the case sharpened into something far more chilling than anyone expected. Latrese Curtis's body was discovered on January 30th, 2008, just off a highway in Raleigh, North Carolina. The last person known to have spoken to her was her husband during a phone call around 10 p.m. the night before. When she didn't make it home, a missing persons report quickly turned into something far worse. As detectives began digging into the timeline, they found themselves unraveling a complicated string of events, layered with secrecy and dishonesty. Just hours after Latrese was found, a lead from that same state trooper gave police a critical starting point. He had run the license plate of a car seen near the scene in the early morning hours. The registration came back to Robert Reeves. Robert, as it turned out, was a minister from Durham. At first, investigators couldn't place him in Latrese's life at all. But that changed quickly once they began analyzing her phone records. Not only had she recently been in contact with Stephen, just as her husband had confirmed, but it was also revealed that Stephen was renting a room from Robert Reeves. And suddenly, what once looked like an unrelated coincidence began to look like a carefully tangled thread. With the link between Robert and Latrese now established, investigators needed to hear directly from both him and Stephen to understand what, if anything, tied them to Latrese's death. On February 1st, 2008, just 2 days after her body was found, both men agreed to meet with detectives for questioning. Almost immediately, officers noted something unusual. Robert had visible injuries, including a cut on his hand and several scratches on his legs that looked fresh. When asked, he claimed the wounds were from helping move a piece of furniture, a desk specifically. But Stephen, who was allegedly there for the move, later contradicted that explanation. As the conversation continued, Robert quickly redirected attention away from himself and toward his roommate. He told detectives that Stephen had been intimate with Latrese on January 29th and that during their time together, she had expressed a desire to make their relationship more serious. Robert also mentioned that Stephen had received a phone call from Latrese in the early hours of January 30th. On top of that, Robert stated that Stephen owned a variety of knives and swords, and added, rather casually, that he once discovered a gun under Stephen's pillow. In what felt like record time, Robert had managed to place suspicion squarely on Stephen's shoulders. Given Stephen's personal ties to Latrese, investigators couldn't ignore the possibility that they might be looking at their lead suspect. Still, Robert had his own questions to answer, namely, why his car was spotted near the scene. When asked, he said he had no explanation. According to him, Stephen had regular access to the keys and often borrowed the car, especially since Stephen's own vehicle had been damaged recently. Robert claimed he didn't keep track of every time the car was used, making it difficult for him to say when Stephen had last driven it. When it came to his own whereabouts that night, Robert told officers he'd attended a church-related event, leaving the house around 8 p.m. Before heading out, he said he saw a white vehicle matching Latrese's in the driveway. By the time he returned at approximately 11 p.m., both Stephen and Latrese were gone. He insisted he stayed home for the rest of the night. Whether his alibi would hold up, however, was still to be seen. When detectives sat down with Stephen, he was open about his relationship with Latrese, confirming the affair. He explained that he had used Robert's vehicle in the past, back when his own car had been out of commission due to damaged tires. But according to Stephen, his vehicle had been repaired 2 weeks earlier, and he hadn't driven Robert's car since. He also noted that when he got home at around 1:30 a.m., Robert's vehicle was no longer parked outside. Stephen also had an alibi to support his timeline. When officers reviewed the home's security system, the alarm records showed his personal code had been used around 1:30 a.m., lining up exactly with his account. Interestingly, the system showed another entry about an hour later, this time using the master code, a code only Robert was authorized to use. Like Darren, Stephen voluntarily provided a DNA sample and allowed police to photograph him for the investigation. At the scene, officers had found a large amount of forensic evidence, including blood inside Latrese's car and damage to the console. Multiple DNA samples were collected from within the vehicle, and the results showed a mixture, Latrese's being the most prominent. Once Darren's DNA was analyzed, he was officially ruled out. The same outcome followed for Stephen. Both men, though initially scrutinized, were eliminated as suspects by forensic evidence. But when Robert's DNA was finally tested, investigators got the result they were waiting for. His DNA matched the unknown profile found inside Latrese's vehicle. On February 2, 2008, Robert Reeves was taken into custody and charged with first-degree murder. News of the arrest sent a wave of disbelief through both Raleigh and Durham, especially within the congregation where Robert served as a minister. Members of his church community struggled to understand how someone they trusted could be linked to such a violent act. Even those close to Latrese were stunned. By all accounts, she had never interacted with Robert directly. But as the investigation moved forward, a much darker reality surfaced. Robert hadn't just been wearing a collar, he'd been wearing a mask. Stephen eventually told investigators that he had met Robert sometime in 2007 while at a local mall. During their conversation, Robert asked about Stephen's work and mentioned he could help him find a job. The two crossed paths a few more times before Robert extended an offer, a room for rent at his home for $300 a month. Stephen, who was looking for housing at the time, agreed and moved in. About 2 months into his stay, Stephen's girlfriend, who he had been visiting on the night Latrese disappeared, began receiving disturbing phone calls. The anonymous caller threatened violence, specifically warning that Stephen's basketball career could be ruined. Stephen said he too got calls from a blocked number, and one of the callers ominously mentioned hoping he was armed. Later that day, Stephen noticed something alarming. His personal firearm had vanished. He claimed Robert had taken it without his knowledge. Then on December 11, 2007, Stephen tried to visit his girlfriend again but ran into car trouble, a flat tire. After fixing it, he resumed his trip, only to start receiving threatening calls again that night. When he finally left to head back home, he found that all 4 tires on his vehicle had been slashed. That same night, Robert called Stephen and mentioned someone had been ringing the doorbell and running off. After hearing about the vandalism, Robert offered to have Stephen's car towed, but Stephen declined to return home, saying he no longer felt safe there. The following day, Robert had Stephen's car brought back to the house and allowed him to borrow his own car to get to school until repairs could be made. But as police dug deeper, they discovered something strange. Robert had 3 separate phone numbers, 2 mobile lines and 1 landline. One of those cell phones, which he jokingly referred to as the fun phone, was used to make all of the threatening calls to Stephen and his girlfriend. Investigators came to a chilling conclusion. Robert had developed an unhealthy fixation on Stephen. When his feelings were rejected, his frustration seemed to grow into something darker, ultimately turning his rage toward Latrese. Authorities believed that he had followed her that night, then took her life, leaving her by the roadside. For those who knew Robert only as a pastor, the news was impossible to digest. The man they had turned to for guidance and prayer had been hiding a life none of them could have imagined. One of Robert's fellow pastors at the church spoke out in his defense, describing him as a respected man of faith with deep knowledge of Scripture and strong interpersonal skills. He's a man of character. This doesn't align with who he is, the pastor said. However, he also acknowledged that he had only known Robert for about 3 years. What many people in the congregation were unaware of was Robert's past. Long before he became known as a minister, he had faced serious legal trouble. In 1987, he was charged with a sexual offense involving a minor. The following year, he was convicted on third-degree sexual charges and served time for the crime. Robert Reeves stood trial for the murder of Latrese Curtis in September 2009. Prosecutors presented a compelling case built on both forensic evidence and personal testimony. Stephen took the stand and spoke about the inappropriate conduct he had experienced while living in Robert's home, describing a troubling pattern that, prosecutors argued, wasn't unique to Stephen. The prosecution asserted that Robert had a history of crossing boundaries with young men and suggested that his behavior towards Stephen was part of a larger pattern. According to their theory, Latrese became a target because of Robert's obsession and his inability to accept rejection. The defense attempted to shift suspicion onto Stephen, arguing that Robert wouldn't have been physically capable of committing the crime due to an old injury from a stabbing incident years earlier. They painted him as a man with limited mobility and suggested that someone younger and stronger would have been more likely to carry out the attack. Who's the more likely suspect, the defense asked? A college athlete or a man with limited use of one arm? They also denied that any emotional motive existed. According to their argument, Robert's alleged interest in Stephen didn't extend beyond a brief rejection. They dismissed the idea that it could have driven such a violent act and tried to explain away the DNA by suggesting it could have ended up in Latrese's car through indirect contact. 6 witnesses were called by the defense, but despite their efforts to cast doubt, the evidence was too strong. The jury reached a unanimous decision. Robert Reeves was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life behind bars. The reason behind Latrese's tragic death is one that still leaves people searching for answers. To take someone's life out of bitterness and rejection is both cruel and senseless. That a trusted spiritual leader could live such a double life only deepened the heartbreak and revealed a side of him that no sermon could ever hide. Nothing about what Latrese did justified what happened to her. As mentioned earlier, her name has too often been overshadowed by the man who took her life. A headline like "The Pastor Who Killed" might catch attention, but this wasn't just a dramatic tale. It was the tragic loss of a young woman at the hands of someone who wore the mask of righteousness and convinced many he was trustworthy. At only 21, Latrese was pursuing an education, sharing laughter with her loved ones, and building a future. She was a student, a daughter, a friend, and a sister. Her life mattered far beyond the crime that ended it. She wasn't simply a name in a case file, she was a whole person whose story deserves to be remembered. May Latrese Curtis be remembered for how she lived, not how her life was taken, and may she rest in peace. If you found this story meaningful, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more true crime podcasts like this one.